During this era, several technological advances really began to take shape. One of which, um, some of which were British, in a sense that before the United States fully industrialized, Britain actually had about a 2 decade head start. Now, in the next class in History 1302, you're going to talk about America's Industrial Revolution and how we basically lapped the field. So many different things that you utilize on a daily basis that change the world are as a result of American innovation. But in the early 1800s, America was still lagging a little bit behind. But they are aware of various different technological advances that had really begun as a result of the Industrial Revolution in Great Britain. One of such was the steamboat. Okay, we're going to talk a little bit about that in a second. The biggest advancement in this era, though, happened in the 1790s and really took off in the 1800s. And it was invented by an American named Eli Whitney. Eli Whitney invented what's called the cotton gin. Okay? So as you had steam-powered engines around this time, nowadays you could run a cotton gin by steam. And the cotton gin would be effective at removing those tediously placed seeds in short staple cotton. So, the United States, typically, their agrarian culture around this time was largely based still upon tobacco and sugar. You did have some cotton, you had some wheat, you even had hemp, stuff like that. But generally speaking, cotton was still the biggest product to be exported. Enter Eli Whitney's cotton gin. The cotton gin became so effective at removing seeds from the short staple cotton that it did several different things. One, you no longer had to rely on long staple cotton being grown in coastal and tidal type areas. Long staple cotton seeds are easily removed. Okay? It's a finer type of cotton that's not quite as easily grown, though. Short staple cotton is the type of cotton that you typically see on a daily basis. This cotton shirt, that's made from short staple cotton. Most of the stuff you see around your house and your clothes, that's short staple cotton. Well, short staple cotton was really, really difficult because of those seeds. Well, now the cotton gin removes those seeds, and it can do in a short amount of time the work of about 50 people. So in one day, one person utilizing a cotton gin could remove as many seeds as 50 people could in one day. That's a massive invention. That's great. Okay, you're gonna need fewer laborers at that, right? Right? Okay. Remember also around this time, the United States had basically doubled in size as a result of winning the American Revolution and declaring our independence. We doubled in size. And therefore you have more land. And if you have more land, and now you also have short staple cotton that is now far more efficient to grow and harvest, now it becomes immensely more profitable. Now you're going to need more labor, because even though it takes fewer people to harvest it, you're going to make so much money by growing it because you have massive amounts of land, especially in southern states where the temperature is more stable and it's warmer. You have a more temperate climate that will be conducive to growing year-round, possibly. So from that standpoint, yeah, it's more efficient, but with more available land, it's now going to be cheaper. You're going to need more labor because you're going to have more land to grow cotton on. Think about that. Plus also, tobacco and the tobacco industry had started to kind of go down. Tobacco is a very difficult uh, crop to harvest and grow. So, from that standpoint, you start to see a shift from a tobacco based industry to one that's going to be a little bit more focused towards cotton and eventually, in the southern aspect, almost entirely based off of cotton. Okay. Well, who do you go to if you need more laborers? You just pay people money, right? You got so much hand over fist, you're making a lot of money? No. Traditionally, African slaves had performed much of the agrarian labor in places like the American South. Now, because of the cotton gin and the availability of land and the profitability of short staple cotton, you're going to need more slave labor. The cotton gin had the unintended consequence of drastically increasing the amount of slave labor in the United States. So a lot of people who had access to land could grow more. They needed more land. They needed more area to grow their cotton. They needed more people to work in the fields. And by and large, they used African slave labor. In 1808, the United States no longer imported slaves from Africa itself. And from that point forward, slaves would either be born into slavery or they would be traded from one another place around the United States. We would no longer import slaves from Africa in 1808. But the damage had already been done. Okay? Eli Whitney's cotton gin had the unintended consequence of increasing the American slave labor system, especially in the American South, where the weather is warmer and you have a longer year-round climate that's conducive to growing cotton. Okay, so that was that unintended consequence. The other thing that Eli Whitney did besides invent the cotton gin was he advented the idea of having interchangeable parts, spare parts, if you will. So say, for example, you have an issue with your car and your battery dies. Well, you really could go to like AutoZone and they'll check your battery and replace it for you right there. You can buy one for $150 or however much it is, and then a few minutes later you're up and back on the road. Or, oh, your tire blew out. Oh, you can go to Firestone and get a replacement or buy a new set or something like that. The idea of interchangeable parts is very important around this time because you have farmers who, if they had broken equipment, were shut down. But if there was a piece of equipment that could have a spare part that fits, replace the broken part of the overall piece of equipment, you have far fewer expenditures and you can get right back to working. Okay. Also, think about all the people moving across to various different parts of western areas of the United States or moving land or perhaps just going from city to city. You've got to have your carrier and your buggies and whatnot. What if one of your wheels breaks? You don't need to replace the entire schooner, wagon. Maybe you just need to repair an axle. Okay. Eli Whitney's interchangeable parts mantra really took off around this time, and it revolutionized the way that Americans fix their parts and the way that they fix the various different things that they need to conduct their daily business. Okay? Kind of like how we do elsewhere with the idea that, yeah, you're not going to buy a new car if your battery dies. If you do, if you buy a new car when your battery dies, you got a lot more money than I do. Let me put it that way. Okay, that's pretty interesting. I mentioned the steamboat a little bit earlier. There had been various different experiments in England with steam power. And instead of needing an actual row to make a boat move, you could produce a heat element that produces steam that would turn a turbine, which would crank an engine, creating power for a boat to move on water. Okay? So it was around this time that, because America was expansive, it was very difficult for um, for folks to move stuff in and around. But if you could move raw materials, you have plenty of navigable rivers, especially in the eastern half of the United States, which compromises the U.S. at this point in America's history. You could perhaps move things on water via steamboat. Ah, interesting. By the way, the idea of a turnpike also came about this time. A turnpike is basically a toll road. So if you've ever taken the Dallas North Tollway or you've driven on George Bush Tollway, you go through, you have your toll pass, and you go through, and hopefully you're up to date. Hopefully you're not just haphazardly driving through. I think they fixed that though with license plates. But otherwise, though, the idea of having paved roads to connect city from city, as opposed to having trails or dirt roads, now having paved roads that can actually drain rain effectively, that actually becomes popular. The problem is it's expensive. Okay, so it's expensive to have somewhat of a your early crushed rock type pavement that was smoother. Nowadays we have asphalt, okay, and concrete. But back then, like a crushed rock, it was very expensive, especially if you needed somebody to survey. Oh, what do you do if you're trying to carry a horse and buggy up a hill, up the side of a mountain? That's going to be exceptionally tedious. So now maybe you have to build roads around mountains and mountain passes, and that becomes further expensive. There has to be a way to pay for it. So you pay a toll at the front, you can head on the turnpike. Okay? Also around this time, you have the idea of what it's like to live in a city. In the early 1800s, less than 5% of all Americans lived in a city of people larger than 8,000. Okay? Think about where we live today. We live in the Metroplex. There's like 7.5 million people that live in the DFW area. This is not a small area. There are a lot of people in the Dallas-Fort Worth area. Okay? Dallas itself has like 1.25 million people. But you look at all the suburbs around it. Plano is like 300,000. Garland has like 200,000. Mesquite is like 100. Allen has like 100. McKinney has like 150. Same with Frisco. It's like, oh my gosh, all these places are really big. Then you have Fort Worth, and you have all the towns in Tarrant County. This is a populated area. Okay? 7.5 million and growing. Well, large cities in America like New York had like 60,000 people. That was big for 220 years ago. Nowadays, New York City, just Manhattan alone, is over 2 million, but then you include the boroughs, it gets significantly bigger. So, you see a difference between Thomas Jefferson's ideal agrarian American life, self-sustaining, simple, and the city life. If you lived in a city, typically it's because you had more resources. You were more likely to be wealthy, perhaps opulent, have some sort of status, and you wanted to have various different cultural things like music shows, concerts, libraries. You demanded more culture for your entertainment. So there had to be something to provide for people in cities that would keep them entertained and keep economies going there, especially for people who had money. People who lived out in the sticks, they didn't need all that stuff. But if you live in a city, you're more likely to want it. And at that time in America's history, you were more likely to be wealthy. And Thomas Jefferson, even with his great idea of how America could be this country of small towns and agrarian lifestyles, he started to recognize that that was probably not going to be the long-term future for America.